So let's round up 120 or so of the lads to hit the table, and drown the foe on the endless waves of violence of the green tide. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking orcs once more, and in this video I thought we'd do a focused look at perhaps one of my favourite detachments from the new codex, some proper support to make horde orcs viable and scary, and take the oft-quoted maxim of boys before toys to the absolute limit. In general, in Warhammer 40k, orcs have typically been considered to be a bit of a horde-style faction, lots and lots of boys, often not necessarily equipped with the best gear, but a lot of enthusiasm and raw violence, hurtling themselves into battle yelling war. Models-wise, we have three types of boys technically now. Perhaps slightly unfortunately, the Green Tide only really supports regular boys, and it doesn't give you any sort of benefits for Beast Snagger boys. I guess they do have their own detachment in the Big Hunt, but I think it would have been really quite fun if they'd made the detachment usable for both of them. Currently for the Orcs Games Workshop I have two different boys kits on offer. The newer one on the left I do think has some very nice sculpts. They're standing a bit more upright and maybe looking a bit more hulky and dangerous compared with the older boys kit that you can see on the right. Though it does come with a flaw that you can't equip the entire boys mob with both shooters or with choppers. You have to build a slightly awkward mix of the two, and the sculpts are a bit more monoposed than the previous one that you can see on the right. To be honest, on the table when they're all painted the same though, I think it adds some good variation to the horde. Unlike some model kit updates, they maybe don't look as jarring side by side as some. I certainly recommend for the rank and file you might be good looking for some second hand miniatures. Can be a cheaper way to put a whole bunch of boys in the army, and potentially even dig into some of the more fantasy kits from Games Workshop. If you were looking for some newer plastic boys for the Force, I'd certainly buy them through discount retailers as opposed to Games Workshop direct. I do have a few listed in the video description below if you'd like to support the channel, usually 10 to 20% off Games Workshop miniatures versus the web store. A big thank you to you guys using those when you buy things, it does help support the channel. Green Tide has generally been an army archetype I've been kind of interested in over the years. I do have a Green Tide army list of my own. That one dates from around about 5th edition, and it has been an army that's had its waxes and wanes over the years. In 7th edition you had that crazy formation where you could put like 100 boys in one single slightly mad unit, not really very practical but kind of hilarious. In 8th edition there was quite a lot of love for 30 strong boys mobs with war bosses, pain boys and weird boys, basically being immune enough to morale and enough attacks to really hurt and bring down most of the enemy army. Though in 10th edition, horde style infantry orcs hasn't really been quite as much in favour. Typically the way to go has been smaller squads of boys with war bosses jumping out of trucks, and a lot of people fielding beast nagger boys, knobs or mega knobs instead as well. It does genuinely look like the Green Tide formation has managed to change things though. It does seem that there's enough in this detachment to get people interested in playing it competitively, and it already seems to have had a couple of placings at tournaments even in the first weekend after Orcs came out. Getting into the army rules, and the Green Tide's main core rule is this one called Mob Mentality. Basically boys units get a 5+ invulnerable save, and if you've got 10 or more models in the units then you get 2 reroll saving throws of 1 made against that attack. As mentioned, it is just supporting the core boys unit. It does have the boys keyword here, but the Beast Snagger boys don't get that, so it's very much your standard boys and not the ones that want the more savage orc type aesthetic. And overall this one just adds a lot of durability to the force, rather than just having the 5+ invulnerable save on the turns of the war. Instead you get that all game long. This one tends to be a benefit that's going to be a lot better against things that actually have a bit of AP, of course. It's not going to make any difference against AP 0 attacks on at least the 5+ invulnerable save type bit of it, but it really is quite satisfying when you're bouncing off things like las cannons or melter guns that should by all rights kill any one boy straight dead right there, and then you ping them off an invulnerable save instead, or even re-roll a saving throw of 1 to bounce the save that way. Durability is often one of the most important things to horde type Warhammer builds, given that due to the amount of terrain on the table you're unlikely to be able to hide literally everything, so some things are going to get shot, and it's kind of important that your most important units don't just get focused down too easily, as if the opponent just brings all their weight to bear on one unit. If that unit was doing something absolutely critical like holding down an objective, then having just a few models survive or none of them survive could be a really big swing. Otherwise, the reroll saves of one thing looks like it's done when the attacks are initially allocated. So basically, if your opponent targets a unit that's got 10 or more models in it, you will get to reroll saving throws of 1 against that attack, at least for that unit's attack. Even if, say, they're attacking with a bunch of different weapons and take them down to below the 10 model strength, you still get those reroll saving throws of 1 against the later weapons. Overall, this one I'd say is okay, but not massive. It equates to around about a plus 8% durability boost, which is alright. It's actually a bit more meaningful if the boy squads get cover and get targeted by AP0 weapons. That way it's more like a plus 16% increase to your durability, quite a lot more meaningful than if you're just on the invulnerable saves. Overall though, I would rate it as a good core rule, and definitely gives the boys the survivability they need to foot slog. Moving on to stratagems, and first up for 1 CP we've got Bulldozer Brutality. This one allows your orcs to fight if they're within 3 inches and the units overall within engagement range. With the base of boys being what they are, this means that you're likely to get your mob fighting in 3 ranks rather than 2 ranks. Plus it could be kind of helpful around certain terrain setups as well, say if some of the boys can't quite make it into melee due to some terrain being awkwardly in the way. You likely have to weigh that up against the reroll wound rolls thing from competitive streak. Next up for 1 CP, there's Come On Lads. This one's a nice simple one to put more boys on the battlefield in the command phase. You get to return D3 plus 2 orcs to the mob. So usually in theory land, that's another 34 points worth of boys on the table, which isn't bad in itself in a detachment where all the benefits revolve around boys. In reality, most of the time it's going to have more value than that though, given that you could put those boys at the front of the unit if you wanted to decrease the charge distance the unit had to do. And it can be handy that it happens during the command phase as well, as it means that you could potentially restore the squad to greater than 10 models strong so it doesn't have to test battle shock, and potentially add yet more durability by restoring them to 10 models strong so they get those rerolls again. Can be really nice if you could put just a bunch more high objective control models to swing an objective as well. That could be really big as well. Definitely a staple one here. For 1 CP, there's Competitive Streak. This one's a battle tactic where your boys' units gets to reroll wound rolls of 1 in melee, though if you've got 10 or more models in your squad, you get to reroll all wound rolls, and that's massively better. Does mean that it's really quite good for squads that have got 10 or more models in, but kind of bad for squads that are depleted. With the sheer weight of chopper attacks at AP -1, that is going to stack a bunch more saves on even tough things like enemy vehicles, and it is quite nice that any attached characters that are in the unit can enjoy that as well. War bosses will be wounding vehicles really quite easily. Pain boys will quite like it, both their power claw and their earthy syringes. Again, I'd consider this one kind of a staple one. I'd usually rate this one over Bulldozer Brutality, though obviously might depend on the situation. Moving on for 1 CP, we've got Bragging Rights. In your command phase, 2 boys units within 6 inches, both count as having 10 or more models in them for detachment rules, plus enhancements and stratagems. Unfortunately, I'd say that this one really is kind of super niche. The reroll saves of one thing is alright, but hardly worth spending a CP for. I guess maybe it might be best if you desperately want the reroll wound rolls thing in melee, and you can't use Come On Lads to restore the squad to 10 or more models. In general though, I'd probably rate this as one of the worst stratagems. For 1 CP, Tide and Muscle can be pretty fun though. Boys units get to add the current battle round number to the charge roll. Obviously this one gets more and more valuable towards the end of the game. Could mean that you could do some ludicrously long charges very easily with boys later on. It's going to be slightly lower yield early on in the game, but in particular it looks kind of nice for weird boys jumping boys around in turn 2 and turn 3. You could be getting 7-inch charges on the go on turn 2, or 6-inch charges turn 3. Could definitely be disruptive to have boys warp across the board and then go straight into combat with something that the opponents don't like, maybe stealing an objective at the same time. Certainly want to consider though whether or not it's worth it each time you make a longish charge with a boys unit, and it's better to do this versus save it for a CP reroll. Finally for 1 CP there's Go Get 'em. This one's an interesting and disruptive kind of surge move that the orcs get. When the orcs boys unit gets shot, then your boys get to move d6 inches directly towards the unit that's closest to them, and they can use that to move in engagement range. As everything gets better, if you've got 10 or more models in this detachment, then you get to move a flat 6 inches if that's the case, basically meaning that the opponent can't really afford to get anywhere near a squad of boys and then shoot those boys unless they want to suddenly be in combat and no longer able to shoot them with anything else. This one can be really quite spooky and annoying for enemy gun lines. If shooting's the thing that they need to do to be able to clear the boys out, then this could really mess with their priorities. Maybe a little bit less super exciting if they've got something powerful to countercharge with though. This stratagem though I think is a really big source of strength for a detachment. It means that the enemy has to really think about where they're putting their units far more than they'd have to do if it didn't exist. And basically each time your unit's shot and it takes casualties, you can decide whether or not this is actually worth it or not. You could use it to do clever things like try and defend objectives, though the ball's kind of in your opponent's court as to whether or not they try and prevent it, or they have to take the hits that you could use this if you wanted to. Moving on to enhancements, and the limitation on these is that they're all infantry only. Ferocious Show Off is a nice cheap one for 10 points, plus 1 strength for the character, or plus 3 strength if they're in a 10 model unit or more. This one seems like a nice points filler, absolutely fine to have on a war boss where you'd be getting, say, strength 13 on his power claw and wounding really quite tough stuff quite easily. I guess doesn't really hurt to have the squad to be just a little bit more nasty against big tough stuff that might try and tie them up. Brutal but Cunning is 25 points. This one's a CP farming one, where on a 3 plus in the command phase, if you're in a unit of 10, then you gain a CP. Otherwise, it's a 5 plus if your mob's depleted. I'd say this isn't awful, but you get a pretty reasonable chance to farm command points with Gretchen already, making it a bit more situational. Otherwise, Bloodthirsty Belligerence is 15 points. This one allows you to reroll advanced rolls, and if you've got 10 or more models in the squad, you get to reroll charge rolls as well. This one's maybe not awful on a more on-the-board character, particularly in terms of the why you could have a boys unit just surging a very long way across the table, though it's absolutely amazing for weird boys in my opinion. Means that even if you use Dad Jump turn 1 and you use the +1 to charge stratagem turn 1, then you'd have a 66% chance of making a charge then. Certainly isn't reliable, but is really quite a big threat and going to happen more games than not. And of course, it's even more reliable if you save till turn 2, a 7-inch charge with a reroll. I think it's more like 80 to 90% chance to go off. And again, just means that you could be drowning some enemy troops in a tide of boys coming from nowhere, and then hopefully have them sat all over the objectives for the opponent to deal with next turn. Finally, for 20 points, we've got Raucous Warcaller. This one means that the bearer's unit always counts as 10 models or more for the detachment rule and stratagems. I'd say in basic boys mobs, this one's kind of okay. A couple of the stratagems might be a bit easier to use, such as the reroll wound rolls one, and I guess it keeps your surge moves going a little bit. In terms of getting the reroll one to save type thing, you maybe save an extra 1 or 2 orks per 20. Overall, it just doesn't really seem enough for 20 points to me. However, though, this one can apply to non-boys units, including notably mega knobs. The way that the detachment rule is worded, it means that you get to reroll saving throws of 1 if there's 10 models in your squad, even for non-boys units, and that's a whole different deal compared with low save boys versus high save mega knobs. If you've got AP 0 attacks attacking them, that basically means that they've given you a 2 plus rerollable save. You certainly don't get many of them around in 10th edition Warhammer 40k, and this one really is a pretty reasonable increase in durability for mega knobs, unless they decide to patch it out of the game in some way. Overall, between all that, I think you've got a pretty interesting detachment there. It goes without saying that you probably want as many boys mobs as you can possibly field. All of them will be a lot more valuable as they're plenty tough, have a nice damage dealer stratagem to punch up against heavies a little bit, and can get into combat really quite disruptively with things like that surge move and weird boys, plus the big charge stratagem and rerolls, and maybe come on lads for a few more boys to just turn up on objectives exactly where you need them, maybe giving you a little bit more oomph to the mob that's the most important each turn. Overall, pretty good stuff, and I feel like at current points cost, it just about gets there in terms of making them competitive. Let's get into the relevant data sheets, and of course we have to start with those boys. Currently 85 points per 10, getting you a toughness 5, 5 plus save, objective control 2 greenskin, moving 6 inches across the board, and in general, if you're playing for more competitive or optimized lists, they want to have choppers rather than shooters these days. The shooters haven't changed since pre-codex, and nobody was running them before. I don't think they've got in any way better, but that's really going to change for more competitive armies. I get a bunch of slugger attacks if they need a tiny bit of small arms going in, and then they'll hit with mass strength 4 AP1 and damage 1 attacks in close combat, 3 attacks per boy, going up to 4 attacks at strength 5 during the war, and then they can be backed up by a couple of special things within the unit. I would likely be tempted to put a couple of rocket launchers in the squad, maybe towards the back ranks that might be a little bit less likely to make it into combat. They can just incidentally randomly flatten a few Space Marines with the blast keyword. I think that is handy to have in an army with some fairly limited shooting. Otherwise, for the Norb, it makes sense for him to have a Power Claw, 3 attacks at Strength 9, AP 2 and Damage 2, going up to 4 at Strength 10 in the war. Overall, it means you've got a unit that just flat out deletes most lighter enemy infantry units that they contact, can be fairly good against things like Space Marines, but are still going to struggle against things like tough vehicles and monsters unless they've got some sort of fighty characters to lead them. You can have 2 different characters leading a boys unit that's got 20 strong, and that often seems to be a popular choice, particularly combining war bosses and pain boys. You could go war boss and weird boy. Finally, in 10th edition, just to help dominate the objectives even more, they've got that Get the Good Bits special rule, which means that you get sticky objectives in your command phase. If the mob starts on the objective, then they basically plant an orky flag there. That objective will remain yours until your opponent can control it at the start or end of any turn. Occasionally that can be really big in missions, say for example allowing a boys mob later in the game to abandon that objective and go and dispense some more violence if you're sure that the opponent can't get to it. In general, I feel like most green tide armies are going to want to cram in about as many of these guys as they possibly can. Just makes sense given that the detachment rule and all the stratagems are really favoured around them. In 2000 points games, I can see people just taking the full 120 each time. Otherwise though, in Codex Orcs they've got some rather good support characters. The war boss was 65 points and he was completely unchanged in the Codex, really quite nice as he's very efficient. He'll make the boys hit on 2s and contribute a whole bunch of power claw attacks, usually at strength 10 and damage 2. In the round of the war you go up to a crazy 9 attacks and all at strength 11, definitely enough to punch through a whole load of vehicles or enemy space marines there. It doesn't really hurt that he gets the 6+ leadership as well, that is pretty helpful. Otherwise, for support characters, the Weird Boy at 55 points is another one that's well worth considering. He gets his fun Edbanger Sniking attack, which can actually be very relevant in Green Tide, given that you're probably going to be warping around units of 20 boys in the first place. Having a single shot that just goes off at damage 5 is massive, and I've already had it come up to pretty good effect against enemy characters in the games that I've played here. One Weird Boy just randomly blasts a chaplain straight out of a unit, which definitely made differences in the ensuing combat. The main reason to take the Weird Boy is Dad Jump though. On a 2+ you get to warp your boys across the board. Really very helpful indeed for an army that is generally somewhat slow and ponderous otherwise. As mentioned, that reroll charges enhancement is very nice for him, as is the boosted charge stratagem. So say if you warped turn 2 with that combo on the go, you could be 7-inch on a reroll from doing a charge essentially out of deep striking. If the opponent can't scream properly, it's going to be bad news for them. Otherwise, a unit that didn't really see much play prior to the Codex is the Pain Boy. He's really got his detachment to shine in the Green Tide though, as it's only really worth it if you've got a boys mob that's over 10 models strong. And again, this detachment is going to encourage you to run as many 20 strong ones as you can. He's got a Power Claw for a bunch of Strength 9 attacks or better in the war. Perhaps even more threatening though is his Urti Syringe. He gets that kind of ludicrously dangerous special rule against enemy infantry that on a 4+ he just dispenses d6 mortal wounds to them, which is just massive if you're fighting some heavy infantry like enemy Terminators. And of course his main purpose is to give the squad a 5+ feel no pain type save, something that really works well with the detachment 5+ invulnerable save. That'll defend you quite well against high AP things. This will defend you quite well against more traditional anti-infantry attacks, lots of 1 damage things. Lots of 1 damage things is generally what this is going to be most effective against. It's also got that Grot Orderly for a once per game resurrection of D3 destroyed bodyguard models. Overall, I feel like the detachment's really quite an interesting one and has done enough to make them at least fun to play with. From seeing general discussion and a few games playing with this myself, I must admit that the 20 strong boys blocks with a Pain Boy are just really tough, very intimidating to charge with most units in the game unless it's something with absolutely ludicrous damage. There's a good chance that you probably fall short of killing the characters and then get hit back fairly hard by a bunch of power claw attacks. They can just make a lot of damage go away between reroll saves, invulnerable saves, and cover and things, and then potentially ping back quite hard when it gets to your turn, with Pain Boys resurrecting things and putting a few more boys back in the unit with the stratagem. The Pain Boy is definitely a weak link of the unit, and if the opponent's got any precision attacks, then his 3 wounds means that he could be something that's really worth sniping out in a big way. If you're fighting armies with precision, then it's probably best to try and keep him hidden behind terrain where possible, even if a bunch of the rest of the squad is going venturing out and about. And you certainly need to remember the possibility of epic challenge in close combat. Sometimes you might be able to hide line of sight from a character to the Pain Boy, otherwise they might just step up and smack him dead. Otherwise though, this list is all about the primary objectives, with 120 toughness 5, 5+ invulnerable save, objective control 2 bodies. Then if you're not dominating on primary, you're probably doing something wrong. You should at least be scoring the vast majority of the points and hopefully denying the opponent some of those in turns 2 and 3 at least, before the orcs no doubt start to get a bit thin on the ground. The opponent really needs to keep on coming to you, as if they back off too much they might well lose the entire game even if they do manage to table you. I've certainly had some games where I've lost every single orc on the board, but still managed to win on victory points, as even if they scored good in the last couple of turns, it was a bit too little too late. I think 1 or 2 weird boys with the jump is really quite nice. Getting boys into the enemy's face fast is pretty excellent. particularly combined with that charge boost stratagem and maybe the reroll enhancement. I would still say that transports might not be the most obvious choice, but are still kind of fine. Orcs do get access to efficient ones like the battle wagons and the trucks, though if you're transporting boys in trucks, it means that you're not taking max size units, which is definitely going to have some trade offs in this detachment. Besides that, the big mobs would like to have some supporting squads to run around doing the secondaries. Small squads of Storm Boys, Boss Snickrot, and low cost Gretchen are probably their best friends here. If you can dominate on both the primary and the secondaries, the opponent's definitely going to need to make sure they're scoring things very carefully just to be able to keep up and stay in the game, even if they do win the overall damage game. I do think though with Orcs, as this one is just a bit of a skew list, some armies do have the potential to just counter them really quite hard. Plenty of armies in 40k do just run naturally with lots of units that are just fantastically good against infantry. Say for example Space Marine Ironstorm packing 3 Gladiator Reapers would be a bad sight to see on the other side of the table. Or perhaps certain armies like Astra Militarum packing a lot of blast weapons. Anything with a whole ton of blast is really not going to be good news for 20 strong boys mobs. The wrong kind of unit profiles could also be difficult as well. Basically, any targets that boys led by some fighty characters can't handle easily are going to cause you problems, as you might well not kill them that easily, even if you do throw a whole load of attrition at them. The grenade stratagem can be one option for that, occasionally just a few mortal wounds to take down a really tough target, and then use the sheer weight of numbers to maybe bring down another one or two. That could be enough to swing a combat and turn quite a bad situation into a good one. Finally, I thought we'd just take a look at a couple of army lists. It looks like even on the first week of tournaments following the Orc Codex, a couple of people have managed to do okay with Green Tide, 2 second placings at some small grand tournaments, at least giving a good flavour of what some good players are thinking about. This first one was by Donald Plummer, using it to take second at Carnage at the Keep May Mayhem, and this one unsurprisingly goes for 6 units of 20 boys with choppers, claws, and rockets, led into battle by 2 war bosses with power claws, one with ferocious show off, and one weird boy with bloodthirsty belligerence. That's the one that allows the reroll charges. Those are boys for the core strategy and central objectives, a couple of fighty war bosses to handle big stuff, and one weird boy with his mob skulky in the backfield to launch some charges off with a very easy rerollable short charge. Then in support of all that, it looks like that interesting Mega Armor combo was enough to see play. There's a Mega Armored War Boss with Raucous Warcaller, the one that counts you as 10 models or more to reroll those ones to save. He's leading a squad of 5 Mega Knobs with twin kill saws, and it looks like they'll be jumping out of a truck. Otherwise for support there's 2 units of Gretchen, nice to farm some command points and have expendable units for secondaries, 2 fast moving units of Storm Boys to run around grabbing objectives, and Boss Snickrot, who's the Orky lone operative that can function almost like a discount Calidus assassin. Again, he can jump around the boards, grabbing some victory points when he needs to. Finally, looks like one of the mobs is travelling to the front in style, encased in a battle wagon with cannon, ard case, and the standard free upgrades that it gets. I guess that's one mob that pretty much guarantees getting the charge unless the opponent focuses a whole ton of firepower on that one tough wagon with the AP debuff. Overall, looks pretty fun, lots of pretty logical choices, plus some transports and mega knobs in support for this one. Otherwise, the other list that did well was this one by Jacob Black, coming in second in a small 22 grand tournament. This one really is a foot green tide through and through. We've got 3 war bosses with power claws, one has a big chopper, and they have ferocious show off and raucous warcaller in there, backed up by 3 pain boys, which I'd guess will probably be in the same units, and again that nice weird boy with bloodthirsty belligerence. They're all leading 6 squads of 20 boys with choppers once more. Looks like just 2 of the squads take rockets this time. And then we've got just 11 Gretchen and 2 Storm Boys to run around doing secondary things. Obviously the threat that can't be ignored in this one is the big boss himself, Ghazghkull Thrako with 2 Meganob guards, the Prophet of the War himself to hand out some lethal hits and nastiness to all orcs nearby, plus just being a massive threat in close combat himself, well capable of deleting some of the biggest and toughest enemy units around. Really quite cool to see him doing well, just leading a whole bunch of boys on foot, showing the galaxy the way it's done, no mucking about. Overall, feel like they've done pretty well with the Green Tide. It does seem like a really fun formation. I look forward to hearing all your thoughts and first experiences, if you've played with it at all, down in the comments below. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day, and I'm sure I'll have more for the orcs. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel and you'd like to see more like this, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep these coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.